The ice didn't break. It swallowed him. A German shepherd stood chest-deep in black water, his legs already numb, his breath turning white in the cold. Behind him, a young officer hesitated, hands shaking, holding the tool meant to make it end. "Don't move," someone whispered. No one knew who said it. The dog didn't fight, didn't cry. He just looked up, waiting. Then a truck door slammed. A 68-year-old man ran onto the ice without slowing down. Jonas Hale had already buried too many things in his life. He wasn't about to bury one more. What that officer knew, what the sheriff tried to hide, and why that dog was never meant to survive, none of it stayed under the ice. Before we begin, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Tell us where you're watching from and how this moment made you feel. We truly want to know how far this story can travel across the world. The ice did not announce itself when it opened. There was no sharp crack to warn anyone nearby, no sudden sound to interrupt the quiet. It simply yielded, slowly and without emotion, allowing black water to rise where solid ground had existed moments before. The reservoir had once been part of a working system, a place measured and maintained, but years of abandonment had erased its importance. Now it sat forgotten beneath early winter snow, wearing a calm that felt convincing enough to hide what was happening beneath it. K9. Shadow stood in the hole the ice had given back. He did not thrash, he did not bark, he did not plead. The water had reached his chest, pressing into him with steady patience, forcing the cold deeper with every second. Thin plates of ice clung to his fur, pale against black and tan, forming uneven weights that pulled him downward without urgency. His legs no longer moved, not because they could not, but because he had learned that movement without purpose wasted strength. His ears lay flattened against his skull, not from fear, but from instinct, a physical adjustment to conserve heat. His eyes remained open, dark and focused, tracking the still surface as if the lake might still respond to rules he had learned long ago. Each breath came out uneven. Steam rose briefly above the water, then vanished into the air as quickly as it appeared. Shadow did not vocalize. He did not splash. His body remained aligned, shoulders square, head steady despite the cold tightening around his ribcage. The posture was not accidental. It was the posture of a dog trained to endure discomfort without reaction, to wait for instruction even when none arrived. The lake did not rush him. It waited. Behind him, a few careful steps away, Officer Ethan Brooks stood alone. He was new to the county, transferred less than 3 months earlier, his patrol route still unfamiliar enough to require a map. His uniform was crisp, pressed clean, the fabric unwrinkled by long nights or repeated winters. His boots were dry, free of salt stains and wear, marking him as someone who had not yet learned how the cold here crept into everything. Snow had not yet found its way into the seams of his trousers. The badge on his chest caught the dim light and reflected it back without warmth. Ethan did not look directly at the dog. His gaze hovered instead along the frozen shoreline, fixed on the stiff reeds locked in place by ice, on the smooth stretch of white that pretended to be harmless, anywhere but the water, anywhere but the eyes that waited behind him. In his gloved hand was a short metal tool, dull gray and unremarkable. It did not look like a weapon. It did not need to. It had been issued with a thin folder labeled in neutral language, incident response, the kind of language designed to soften outcomes before they happened. Ethan had opened that folder earlier in the day, standing at a desk that smelled faintly of old coffee and disinfectant, reading each line slowly as if pace might change meaning. He had stopped at the final sentence, unit no longer viable. The words had been highlighted in gray instead of red, as if that made them easier to accept. No explanation followed. No signature, no timestamp, just a conclusion presented as fact. Ethan had closed the folder and sat there longer than necessary, staring at the surface of the desk while the sentence settled into his chest. Shadow had been a working dog. That much was undeniable. Even now, standing half submerged in freezing water, the dog's bearing betrayed discipline. His spine stayed straight. His head did not dip. His attention remained forward. Somewhere in the past, he had been injured during a task that never appeared in any official report. The injury did not show from here, but Ethan knew it existed. He had been told enough to understand that the dog was now considered a liability. a variable that no longer fit neatly into procedure. There were protocols for that. There were forms for that. There were places like this for that. Ethan knew what he was doing. He also knew he did not want to do it. The two truths pressed against each other, tightening his grip until his fingers ached inside the gloves. He told himself the cold had already done most of the work, that the dog's body was failing anyway, that this was less cruel than letting nature finish what it had started. The explanations lined up neatly in his head, practiced and ready, but they rang hollow even before he finished forming them. Shadow shifted his weight. The movement was small, deliberate, costing more effort than it should have. Water trembled around his chest as he adjusted, finding a balance that kept his head above the surface. His breathing shortened, not from panic, but from the cold, steady insistence. Still, he did not vocalize. He did not splash. He did not turn. When Shadow lifted his head and looked back, the movement was slow and controlled. Their eyes met. There was no accusation there, no fear, no plea, only awareness. The kind of awareness that suggested understanding without judgment, as if Shadow recognized the conflict unfolding behind him without needing it explained. Ethan felt the look settle on him like weight. It was not the look of an animal begging for mercy. It was the look of something trained to accept outcomes without protest, to wait for instruction even when instruction had become harm. Ethan turned his face away. His jaw tightened. His shoulders rose slightly as he drew in a breath he did not release. The metal tool came up in his hand, its weight suddenly undeniable. Snow shifted beneath his boots as he adjusted his stance, the sound sharp in the vast stillness. The cold seeped through his gloves, through the layers of fabric and justification he had wrapped around himself. The lake answered with silence. Wind moved across the surface, carrying the faint creak of ice adjusting to pressure. The sound was low and uneven, like something old settling into place. Shadow's breath came faster now, each exhale a brief cloud that vanished before it could linger. The waterline pressed higher against his chest, stealing warmth with methodical efficiency. He did not resist it. He did not fight the sensation. He endured. Time stretched thin. Ethan raised the tool higher. For a moment he thought of the first day he had been issued a uniform, the weight of it unfamiliar but exciting. He had believed then that right and wrong would always be obvious, that procedure existed to protect everyone involved. Standing here now, those beliefs felt distant, brittle, like something that cracked easily in cold weather. Shadow held still. His eyes did not leave the space ahead of him. The surface of the lake reflected nothing back, only dull gray and white, a blankness that offered no guidance. His body trembled, not from fear, but from the strain of holding himself upright against the cold. Still, he did not collapse. Whatever training had shaped him had taught him that as long as the head stayed above water, the fight was not over. Ethan's grip faltered. The raised tool hesitated, suspended between intention and action. His breath caught, fogging his vision, and for a brief moment, he wondered if anyone would ever know what had happened here. The thought did not bring relief. It brought weight. Then the light changed. Headlights swept across the reservoir from the far end of the access road, a wide arc cutting through the blue-gray dusk. The beam skimmed the frozen surface, caught the black water in Shadow's hole, and fractured the isolation the lake had relied on. Snow drifting through the light turned into pale streaks, altering distance and depth, making the scene feel suddenly exposed. Shadow's ears twitched. His gaze shifted toward the source, alert despite the cold locking his legs in place. The movement was automatic, a response ingrained deeper than exhaustion. Something new had entered the space, something unknown. Behind him, Ethan froze. The tool remained raised, but his arm no longer felt steady. The moment he had prepared for no longer belonged to him alone. The lake, the dog, the cold, none of it was contained anymore. The engine sound followed a heartbeat later. Low, steady, unhurried. Tires crunched on packed snow, deliberate and measured. Whoever was driving was not rushing, and that unsettled Ethan more than speed would have. The truck slowed at the edge of the road. Headlights held on the lake, illuminating the water, the ice, the stillness. Shadow remained where he was, breath rising, vanishing, waiting. The ice creaked softly around him, adjusting, listening, as if the reservoir itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what would be taken from it next. The truck did not surge forward. It did not skid or scream to a stop. Instead, it slowed as if guided by a hand that had learned long ago the cost of sudden movement. Headlights remained steady, washing the ice in pale bands of light that revealed texture and danger without exaggeration. The engine dropped into a quieter register, a controlled hum that belonged to someone who understood how noise could carry and how silence could lie. Jonas Hale eased his foot off the pedal and let the vehicle settle where the road allowed. 68 years had taught him that most disasters did not announce themselves with speed. They waited for the moment someone decided not to look closely enough. He stayed seated for a fraction longer than instinct demanded, eyes reading the surface of the reservoir the way he once read ground under fire, noting the darker patches, the faint seams where ice had already betrayed itself. Cold air flooded the cab as the door opened before the truck fully stopped. Jonas stepped out into it without hesitation, the wind striking his face like a physical thing. He did not pull his collar up. He did not pause to adjust his footing. He moved because stopping invited doubt, and doubt wasted time. The ice responded to his first step with a thin, brittle sound, sharp enough to register, but not enough to warn him back. Jonas adjusted his weight automatically, distributing it, testing, listening with his feet as much as his ears. The smell of frozen water and old metal mixed in the air, clean and unforgiving. Ahead, the hole in the ice held black water that did not move, and in that water stood the dog. Shadow's head remained above the surface, held there by stubborn alignment and the memory of commands learned before pain. His coat, black and tan beneath the glaze of ice, clung to him in uneven sheets. His breathing came short and shallow, each exhale blooming briefly before the cold erased it. He did not thrash. He did not whine. He watched. Behind him, Officer Ethan Brooks turned at the sound of boots on ice. For an instant, the two men faced each other across the white expanse. Jonas took in the details without effort, the crispness of the uniform, the clean lines, the stiffness in the young officer's shoulders that did not come from cold alone. He saw the hesitation there, unmistakable and unguarded, the kind that slipped through before training could mask it. Ethan saw something else in Jonas's eyes, something that did not ask permission or offer explanation. Jonas did not speak. Questions would take time he did not have. He dropped to one knee at the edge of the hole, the ice biting through denim as if it had been waiting. Without looking back, he slid both hands into the water. The shock was immediate and absolute, a white-hot pain that climbed his arms and stole breath. He did not pull away. He reached deeper, fingers searching by memory and instinct, finding the solid plane of muscle beneath the dog's chest. Shadow reacted not with panic, but with stillness. His body stiffened for a heartbeat, then settled, as if recognizing the difference between harm and help without needing proof. The water trembled as Jonas adjusted his grip, bracing himself against the edge of the ice, lifting with controlled force learned long before age had slowed his joints. Behind them, Ethan took a step back, then another. The movement was involuntary, the kind that happened before thought could intervene. The metal tool slipped from his hand and fell into the snow with a flat final sound that cut through the quiet more sharply than any shouted confession. Ethan stared at it for half a second longer than necessary, as if surprised to see it there, separated from him. "Stop," someone breathed. The word was small, barely formed, and no one claimed it. Jonas hauled Shadow free of the water in one continuous motion, dragging him onto the ice where gravity and cold fought for control. Black water surged back into the hole behind them, closing the space with reluctant efficiency. Shadow collapsed onto his side, muscles shuddering in violent waves as the cold released its grip in uneven pulses. He did not snap. He did not struggle. He endured. Jonas stripped off his old M1965 field jacket and wrapped it around the dog's torso, pulling the fabric tight with hands that trembled now, the delayed acknowledgement of pain finally allowed. He pressed his forearm along Shadow's ribcage, feeling the uneven rise and fall, counting without meaning to. "Stay," he murmured, the word rough and indistinct, hanging somewhere between command and plea. Ethan turned and ran. His boots slipped once on the ice, arms flailing for balance, then found traction as he reached the snow-packed shore. He did not look back. The sound of his retreat faded quickly, swallowed by distance and wind, leaving behind the quiet and the consequences. Jonas did not follow him with his eyes. His attention narrowed to the dog beneath his hands, to the small signs that mattered, the way Shadow's head shifted slightly, the way his breathing stuttered and then steadied, the way his eyes tracked movement even as his body failed him. Jonas adjusted the jacket, tucking it closer, rubbing hard along the dog's shoulders to coax warmth back into flesh that had forgotten it. The cold gnawed at his knees and hands, insistent and personal, but he welcomed it. Pain meant he was still here. "Easy," he said, quieter now. The word meant only for the dog. Shadow's eyes met his, dark and steady despite the tremor that ran through his frame. There was no confusion there, only assessment, the measured attention of an animal trained to read intention through movement and tone rather than promises. He did not resist Jonas's hands. He allowed the contact, resting the weight of his head briefly against the man's forearm, as if making a calculation and finding it acceptable. The headlights remained fixed on them, illuminating the scene without intrusion. Snow drifted through the beams, slow and indifferent, collecting on fabric and fur alike. Jonas became aware of the ache in his shoulders, the numbness creeping along his fingers, the way the cold pressed in from all sides now that the immediate danger had passed. He shifted his grip and began the careful process of lifting, gathering Shadow against his chest in a way that minimized strain on both of them. The dog was heavy, dense with muscle beneath the wet fur, but cooperative, his body rigid with shock rather than resistance. Jonas rose in stages, breath controlled, each movement deliberate. As he turned away from the hole in the ice, the reservoir seemed to settle, its surface smoothing as if nothing had disturbed it. The black water stilled, the ice reclaimed its shape, the place resumed its convincing calm. Jonas moved toward the truck with measured steps, mindful of footing, mindful of balance, mindful of the fragile life pressed against him. The cab door hung open, heat spilling outward in a thin, tempting stream. He reached it and leaned Shadow against the seat, arranging him with care before climbing in himself. Inside, the smell of old fabric and engine heat wrapped around them. Jonas shut the door and rested his forehead briefly against the steering wheel, eyes closed, allowing himself a single breath of stillness before action returned. Shadow lay across the seat, sides heaving, the jacket rising and falling with each breath. Jonas reached out and rested a hand against the dog's neck, feeling the pulse there, fast but present. "Stay with me," he said, the words barely more than breath. Outside, the wind moved across the reservoir, carrying away the last traces of the night's violence. The headlights continued to burn, steady and unforgiving, as the engine idled, waiting for the next decision. The cabin sat deep among pines that had learned to stand without apology. Snow pressed against their trunks and gathered along branches like a held breath, muting distance and swallowing sound. Smoke climbed from the chimney in a thin, uncertain line, dissolving into the night air before it could declare warmth. Inside, the light from the stove moved across rough-hewn walls, steady and amber, a small circle of order carved out of the cold. Jonas set Shadow down on a thick rug near the hearth and knelt without ceremony. The dog's body trembled in delayed waves, the kind that arrived after danger had passed and the cold demanded payment. Jonas rubbed along each limb in turn, methodical, working heat back into muscle with the patience of habit. He counted breaths under his breath, not as prayer, not as hope, but as structure, something to hold when the rest of the world refused to be counted. Shadow endured in silence. His sides rose and fell unevenly, then steadied by degrees, each breath finding a rhythm that did not ask permission. His eyes tracked Jonas's hands with measured attention, following movement rather than sound. He did not lean into the heat. He did not collapse toward comfort. He remained aligned, present, conserving what little strength he had reclaimed. Jonas reached for a towel and began to dry the fur along Shadow's neck and shoulders. The fabric came away darker with each pass, heavy with melt and lake water. When Jonas worked behind the ear, his hand paused mid-motion, fingers stiffening as if they had encountered resistance that should not exist. He adjusted the angle, parted the fur with care, and saw it clearly in the firelight. Ink. Numbers and letters cleanly set, precise in a way that spoke of systems rather than stories. Not a symbol of service, not a mark of honor, a code, a management identifier meant to be read quickly and erased mentally just as fast. Jonas exhaled through his nose and sat back on his heels. Strays did not carry numbers. The realization did not arrive with shock, it arrived with weight, the kind that settled behind the eyes and refused to be shifted by denial. Jonas had seen markings like this before, not on animals, but on crates and cases, on equipment logged and tracked until usefulness ran out. He folded the towel and set it aside, his gaze returning to the dog with a different attention now, quieter and more precise. Shadow's breathing evened out further, the shuddering reduced to a fine tremor that traveled through his frame like residual current. As Jonas continued drying, scars emerged beneath the thinning water, lines that ran straight and deliberate along rib and shoulder. They were old, healed cleanly, arranged with intention, not the ragged story of accident, not the chaotic mark of teeth or claws. These were cuts made by tools, by training, by hands that did not hesitate. Jonas did not comment. He did not ask the room to witness what he had seen. He finished his work and sat with his hands resting loosely on his thighs, listening to the fire breathe and the wind test the cabin's seams. The cold pressed against the walls with persistent interest, but it did not get inside. Later, when the stove had settled into a steady burn and the room held its heat, Jonas rose and moved to the small table near the door. He checked the latch without ceremony, then the second bolt, then the generator switch by habit rather than fear. He did not pace, he did not hurry. Years had taught him that haste invited mistakes. Shadow did not move toward the hearth. Instead, he rose, slowly, deliberately, and placed himself between Jonas and the door. His stance was not aggressive. His tail remained low, still, his head angled slightly, ears adjusting to sound rather than posture. He was not guarding Jonas, he was guarding the threshold. Jonas noticed and stopped. For a long moment, the two shared the space without words. The fire popped softly. Snow slid from the roof in a low, sighing rush. Shadow held position, body coiled with a readiness that had nothing to do with fear. Jonas recognized the behavior immediately, the way one recognized an old drill resurfacing in muscle memory. "You're not here for comfort," Jonas said quietly. Shadow did not respond. He did not need to. The night passed without interruption, but sleep came in pieces. Jonas dozed in the chair by the stove with his boots still on, waking at intervals to check the room by sound and feel rather than sight. Shadow shifted once, adjusting his stance to block a draft Jonas had not noticed, then settled again, eyes open, breath controlled. Morning arrived without color. Light filtered through the trees in thin, pale bands that barely reached the cabin windows. The air inside smelled of pine resin and iron, the familiar scent of a place lived in carefully. Jonas stood, stretched stiffness from his joints, and poured water into the kettle with measured hands. Shadow moved with him, not following, not leading, simply present where presence mattered. When Jonas opened the door, cold air slid inside with quiet confidence. Snow lay undisturbed in the clearing except for one thing that did not belong. Tracks crossed the edge of the space in a wide arc, careful and consistent, never approaching the door itself. The prints were large, evenly spaced, the pressure deliberate, not the wandering curiosity of a hiker, not the staggered path of someone lost. Someone had walked the perimeter. Jonas stepped outside and crouched, fingers brushing the compressed snow at the edge of the trail. The tracks were fresh enough to hold shape, old enough to have settled. Whoever made them had moved without hurry, circling once, then leaving. No attempt to knock, no attempt to enter. Confirmation, not contact. Shadow stood behind Jonas, body angled toward the trees, ears tilted forward to gather sound that had already passed. He did not bark. He did not growl. His stillness was exact, economical, the stillness of an animal that understood procedure. Jonas straightened slowly, scanning the tree line where the tracks disappeared into shadow. The forest returned nothing. Wind moved high above, shaking snow loose in distant showers. The world looked unchanged, convincingly calm. "You were checked," Jonas said, more observation than conclusion. Shadow's head turned slightly, acknowledging without reaction. Jonas went back inside and closed the door with care, setting the bolt into place. He moved to the window and looked out once more, committing the angles and distances to memory. There was no urgency in him now, only clarity, the kind that followed realization rather than preceded action. He knelt again by Shadow and rested a hand briefly on the dog's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth there, the steadiness returning. Shadow accepted the touch without shifting position, eyes never leaving the door. "Stay awake," Jonas said, the words meant for both of them. Outside, the tracks held their shape in the snow, a wide circle drawn with intent. Somewhere beyond the trees, whoever had walked them already knew the answer they came for. The afternoon light thinned early, the kind of winter daylight that never committed to warmth. It slid through the pines in pale sheets and pooled across the clearing without intention, revealing tracks that had already softened and shadows that refused to explain themselves. The wind carried a dry resin smell from the trees and something metallic from the road, a faint reminder that the world beyond the forest still moved. Jonas was splitting kindling when the cruiser rolled in. It did not announce itself with urgency. Tires eased onto the packed snow and stopped at a respectful distance, engine idling with polite restraint. The door opened once, then again. Sheriff Reed stepped out with the ease of a man who believed arrival was always welcome. He was neat in a way that suggested rehearsal, uniform pressed, hat set just so. His smile arrived before his words, practiced enough to feel spontaneous. Reed adjusted his gloves as he walked, eyes lifting briefly to the cabin, then drifting to the truck where Shadow lay visible through the glass. "I hear you picked up a working dog," Reed said, tone light, conversational, as if discussing weather. His gaze flicked to the window again, quick and proprietary, then returned to Jonas's face. Jonas did not ask how he knew. He had already traced the line from tracks in snow to a smile in daylight and found it straight. He rested the axe against the stump and wiped his hands on his jacket, movements unhurried, neither welcoming nor dismissive. "The dog fell through ice," Jonas replied. The words were simple. They did not invite elaboration. Reed nodded once, satisfied with the shape of the answer, if not its substance. His eyes lingered on the truck longer this time, taking in posture and stillness, the way Shadow's head remained angled toward the clearing even at rest. The sheriff's smile did not shift, but something in his attention tightened like a measurement being taken. "Dogs like that need to be registered," Reed said, voice still soft. "Safety regulation." Jonas met his gaze without expression. He did not counter, he did not agree. He allowed the words to settle between them, heavy with implication. "I'll stop by tomorrow," Reed added, already stepping back as if the visit were concluded. "Make sure everything's proper." The cruiser rolled away with the same courtesy it had arrived, tires leaving shallow impressions that the wind would erase by nightfall. Jonas stood where he was long after the engine sound faded, listening to the forest reclaim the quiet. Shadow shifted once inside the truck, a small adjustment, precise. His ears angled toward the road and then returned to neutral, as if filing the visit away rather than reacting to it. Jonas finished stacking the kindling. He carried it inside, set it by the stove, and went about the small tasks that held a day together. Each action fit into the next without hurry. The kettle filled, the latch checked, the generator glance counted and dismissed. None of it was ritual. All of it was habit. Dusk arrived without ceremony. Light drained from the clearing until the trees stood as dark columns against a sky bruised with purple and gray. The cabin windows reflected only themselves. Inside, the stove breathed steadily, iron ticking as it adjusted to heat. Shadow rose once, paced the length of the room with controlled steps, then settled near the back window, posture alert but contained. Jonas noticed the change and let it stand. When he returned from the shed later, the door resisted his hand by a fraction, not locked, not forced, just not where he had left it. He pushed it open and felt the temperature difference first, the faint intrusion of cold that did not belong. The room looked untouched. The chair by the stove remained angled as before. The table held what it had held. Nothing was missing. Something had been added. On the table lay a black zip tie, cut cleanly in half. The ends were squared, precise, the kind of cut made with purpose rather than haste. It sat alone, unremarkable, demanding attention without noise. Jonas did not pick it up. He had seen ties like that before, used to secure things that were not meant to be accounted for, in places where reports were optional and explanations unwelcome. The memory did not arrive as images. It arrived as pressure, a familiar tightening behind the eyes. Shadow stood between Jonas and the door now, body angled, head low, eyes tracking the threshold rather than the room. He did not growl. He did not bare teeth. His presence filled the space with quiet certainty. "Easy," Jonas said, a breath more than a word. Shadow did not move. Jonas checked the perimeter without drama, scanning corners and shadows with practiced economy. He noted what had not changed as carefully as what had. No broken latch, no disturbed snow near the walls. Whoever had come had moved with care, aware of what to avoid. The night settled heavier after that. Jonas sat at the table with the lamp turned low, the zip tie remaining where it was, an object that refused to be ignored by being simple. He reached for the drawer beneath the counter and opened it, fingers finding the weight he had sworn off years ago. The satellite phone was older than most of the equipment he kept, its casing scuffed, its antennas stiff with disuse. He held it without turning it on, feeling the familiar geometry in his palm. This phone belonged to a life he had closed deliberately, a line he had cut to keep the past from bleeding into the present. Shadow's eyes lifted to him, attentive without question. Jonas exhaled and powered the device on. The screen glowed dull and patient. It did not rush him. It waited. He did not dial yet. Outside, wind moved through the pines with new insistence, branches whispering against one another in low conversation. The sound pressed against the cabin, testing its seams the way it had earlier tested the ice. Shadow shifted his weight and adjusted his stance to block a draft Jonas could not feel. The lamp hummed softly. Jonas set the phone down beside the zip tie, the pairing accidental and exact. One represented a promise he had made to himself. The other represented a promise someone else had broken. He looked from one to the other and felt the old calculus surface, the one that measured risk against consequence without emotion. He stood and moved to the window. The clearing lay quiet, convincingly empty. Snow continued to fall, smoothing edges, hiding intention. Somewhere beyond the trees, a road carried vehicles that did not stop, people who did not look, systems that counted and discarded with equal efficiency. Jonas returned to the table and picked up the phone. "Stay," he murmured, not to Shadow, but to the room, to the line he was about to cross. He entered the number from memory. Not because it was often used, but because some things stayed when they mattered. The device clicked and hissed, seeking connection across distance and weather. Jonas listened to the sound with the patience of someone who knew waiting was part of the process. Shadow remained at his post, unmoving, eyes on the door. When the signal finally stabilized, Jonas did not speak right away. He let the silence travel first, a presence rather than a request. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, gaze steady on the table where the zip tie lay. "I need eyes on something," he said at last. The words were plain. They carried no story. The line crackled, acknowledging without reply. Jonas ended the call before explanation could dilute intent. He powered the phone down and set it aside, returning the drawer to its place with a soft click that felt final without being loud. The cabin held its breath. Jonas leaned back in the chair and let the quiet return, not the peaceful kind, but the alert silence that lived between heartbeats. Shadow did not relax. He did not settle near the stove. He stayed where he was, guarding the boundary rather than the man. Outside, snow erased tracks with steady patience. Inside, the zip tie remained on the table, a message delivered without envelope or signature. Jonas did not remove it. He let it be seen by the room, by Shadow, by the night. Somewhere beyond the forest, a smile had measured him and found him present. The night did not argue with his decision. It accepted it. Jonas sat at the table with the lamp turned low, the zip tie still where it had been left, the satellite phone resting beside it like a quiet admission. Outside, the wind dragged itself through the pines, not violent, not gentle, just persistent enough to remind the cabin it was not alone. Shadow remained between Jonas and the door, body angled, weight distributed with intent, eyes awake in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The phone connected on the second attempt. Static pressed in first, then receded, leaving behind a line that held. Jonas did not introduce himself. He did not need to. The voice on the other end did not ask him to. "Keep everything exactly where it is." Marcus Cole's words were calm. stripped of ceremony, spoken by someone who had learned that questions could wait and timing could not. There was no surprise in his tone, only recognition. Jonas closed his eyes briefly, feeling the old alignment slide back into place, the one that existed when responsibility outweighed comfort. "I will," Jonas said. That was all. He powered the phone down and placed it back in the drawer, not because he was finished with it, but because it had done what it was meant to do. Shadow shifted once, adjusting his stance as the room settled again. The zip tie remained untouched. The message had been received. Morning came gray and deliberate. Snow had fallen through the early hours, smoothing the clearing into something deceptively clean. Jonas woke before the light fully arrived, the habit ingrained deeper than sleep. He stood, stretched stiffness from his back, and moved quietly through the cabin, gathering what he needed without hurry. Shadow rose before him, alert and composed, head lifting as if he had already heard something Jonas had not. The sound arrived moments later. Engines, not one, not loud, measured. Vehicles approached without urgency, tires compressing snow with even pressure. Jonas did not reach for the window. He did not reach for anything at all. He stood where he was and waited. Shadow stepped forward and altered his posture. The change was subtle but absolute. His spine straightened, his weight shifted back just enough to anchor, his head lowered by degrees, eyes fixed not on threat, but on approach. No growl, no bark, no tension wasted. Anyone who had trained working dogs would have recognized it immediately, the stance taken when identification mattered more than defense. The vehicle stopped at the edge of the clearing. No sirens, no lights, no show. Doors opened slowly. Boots met snow without hurry. A man stepped into view, tall, lean, dressed for cold without excess. His jacket bore no insignia. His hands remained open at his sides, visible, patient. His hair had gone gray at the temples, not from age alone, but from the kind of work that demanded long attention to things meant to be buried. Marcus Cole did not look at Jonas first. He looked at the dog. Shadow inhaled, drawing the air in with careful consideration, sorting information older than memory. He took one step forward, then stopped. His ears shifted, reading sound and absence with equal precision. After a pause that felt measured rather than hesitant, he sat. Marcus nodded once. "That's him." The words carried no triumph, only confirmation. Inside the cabin, the file opened with a dry sound, paper sliding against paper, the kind of noise that belonged to rooms where stories were flattened into sequence. Marcus worked without commentary, laying documents across the table with methodical care. Jonas watched without interrupting, reading the shape of what was being revealed rather than the words themselves. Transfers. Temporary assignments, locations that repeated without explanation. There were gaps where reports should have lived, replaced by neutral language that explained nothing while pretending to explain everything. Shadow's identifier appeared again and again, stripped of context, reduced to movement and outcome. The pattern was unmistakable once seen. "He was reassigned too often," Jonas said quietly. Marcus inclined his head. "Because he saw something." The file paused there, as if reluctant to continue. Marcus turned another page, revealing notes marked incomplete, then sealed, then reopened years later without resolution. A training scenario flagged as anomaly. A command given and not followed. Shadow had not engaged when ordered to. He had not attacked. He had not complied. He had observed. And that made him inconvenient, Jonas said. Marcus did not correct him. Shadow lay on the floor now, head resting on his paws, eyes open, listening without appearing to listen. His breathing was steady. The posture was relaxed but ready, the balance held with quiet intention. He did not look at the papers. He did not need to. The room felt smaller as the truth settled into it. What Shadow had witnessed had not been an accident. It had been a choice made by people who assumed silence could be trained as easily as obedience. When the dog did not respond as expected, when instinct and training aligned against the command, the system adjusted around him. Not guilty, not dangerous, just unsuitable. Marcus closed the file and stood. "It doesn't end here," he said, not his promise, but his statement. It ended sooner than Jonas expected. By early afternoon, the town moved as it always had, unaware of the recalibration taking place beneath its surface. Sheriff Reed's office door opened without announcement. There was no struggle, no raised voices, no crowd gathered. Paperwork moved across desks with quiet efficiency. The handcuffs clicked into place with the soft finality of metal designed to be undeniable. Reed's practiced smile did not survive the moment. It folded inward, shrinking into something small and unremarkable. He did not argue. He did not protest. He understood too well what had arrived and why. There were no cameras, no press, only process. Jonas did not witness the arrest. He stood in the clearing with Shadow at his side, watching unmarked vehicles come and go without urgency. The forest absorbed the movement, returning to stillness as if nothing had passed through it. Snow continued to fall, indifferent to consequence. Shadow lifted his head as the last vehicle disappeared, ears angling toward the road until the sound faded completely. Then he turned back to Jonas, posture easing by degrees, tension released not into collapse, but into alignment. "It's over," Jonas said. The words felt accurate without being complete. Inside, Marcus packed the file away, sliding it into a case that bore no label. He moved through the cabin once more, eyes noting exits, distances, angles. When he stopped in front of Jonas, he did not offer a hand. He offered acknowledgement. "You did the right thing," he said. Jonas did not answer. Marcus paused, then added softer, "You always did." When the vehicles were gone, the clearing felt wider. Jonas returned to the cabin and sat heavily in the chair by the stove. The zip tie was still on the table. He picked it up now, turning it once between his fingers, then set it aside in a drawer where it would not be mistaken for something else. Shadow moved closer, not pressing, not guarding, simply present. He lay down near Jonas's boots, body angled comfortably, eyes half-lidded but aware. The fire breathed, the room warmed. Outside, the system had corrected itself quietly. Inside, something else had shifted. Jonas rested his hand briefly on Shadow's neck, feeling the steady pulse there, the proof of endurance that did not require explanation. Shadow leaned into the touch for a fraction of a second, then settled. Trust offered without demand. The file was closed, but the story was not finished. Spring arrived without announcement. It did not rush the forest or ask permission of the cold. It moved the way patience always did, quietly, reshaping what had been locked in place rather than breaking it all at once. Ice fractured into smaller sheets along the lake's edge, drifting apart with soft, hollow sounds that carried farther than expected. Each piece slid away without ceremony, leaving behind dark water that reflected the sky as if nothing had ever been trapped beneath it. Jonas waited until the thaw was honest. He did not measure the season by calendars or temperature alone, but by how the ground answered his steps and how the air changed when breathed deeply. When the path to the lake softened underfoot and the pines released their winter stiffness, he took Shadow with him. There was no leash, no command, no destination beyond the water itself. The shoreline looked different now, wider and less severe. Snow retreated in uneven patches, exposing dark soil and flattened grass that seemed surprised to be seen again. The lake stretched out in a dull, shifting mirror, its surface restless but calm, free of the rigid silence that had once claimed it. Jonas stopped several paces back and let Shadow move ahead if he wished. Shadow approached slowly. His gait was measured, neither cautious nor eager, as if he were listening with his whole body rather than just his ears. The black and tan of his coat had filled out again, shedding the dullness of winter for a healthier sheen that caught the light when he turned. He halted at the water's edge and stood there, head lifted, eyes fixed on the moving surface. Time widened around the moment. The lake whispered against itself, small waves tapping the shore with a sound that was neither invitation nor warning. Shadow did not step forward. He did not retreat. He held his position and watched, breathing steady, muscles quiet beneath his fur. Jonas remained behind him, hands at his sides, careful not to fill the space with expectation. No one spoke. Shadow leaned forward just enough to test the air, drawing in the scent of wet earth and open water. His ears adjusted, tracking the soft crack and sigh of drifting ice farther out. For a long while, he did nothing else. The stillness was complete, not the rigid stillness of training, but the thoughtful pause of something considering its own history. Then Shadow turned. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, final. He stepped away from the lake and walked back toward solid ground without looking over his shoulder. No signal marked the choice, no reward followed it. He simply left the water behind. Jonas released a breath he had not known he was holding. They returned to the cabin with the same quiet they had brought with them. The day warmed by degrees, sunlight filtering through branches that had begun to loosen their grip on winter. Shadow stayed close without pressing, his presence easy now, no longer assigned to thresholds or angles of defense. The place had stopped asking him to be ready for anything at all. Life settled into a new rhythm that did not demand attention to be meaningful. Tools leaned against walls instead of being stacked near the door. Windows opened on afternoons when the air invited it. Jonas slept longer, deeper, waking without the sharp edge of anticipation that had once claimed him before dawn. Shadow moved through the cabin with unremarkable confidence, learning the shape of days that did not end in command. One afternoon, as the sun lowered and painted the clearing in gold, a rabbit burst from the brush near the tree line. Shadow's head snapped up, body coiling on instinct older than memory. He lunged forward 2 steps, powerful and precise, then stopped. He sat. The decision arrived as if remembered mid-motion, some old rule surfacing and then dissolving under the weight of the present. The rabbit vanished into the trees, unharmed, unaware of the moment it had passed through. Shadow remained seated, ears flicking once, posture easing as the impulse faded. Jonas laughed. The sound surprised him. It came out short and rough, like something unused, then settled into something real. It echoed briefly against the cabin and fell quiet, leaving warmth behind. Shadow glanced back, head tilted, tail giving a single uncertain sweep as if seeking confirmation. "It's all right," Jonas said, the words light. Shadow rose and returned, sitting near Jonas's boots without ceremony. There was no praise to accept, no correction to absorb, just the shared acknowledgement of a choice made and released. That night, the lake reflected stars instead of swallowing them. Jonas sat on the porch with a mug cooling slowly in his hands, the air mild enough to leave the door open behind him. Shadow lay at his feet, breathing slow and even, the rise and fall of his chest matching the quiet rhythm of the forest. The world beyond the trees continued on its way, indifferent and uncorrected, but the space they occupied felt settled. Jonas rested his hand on Shadow's shoulder. The contact was brief, unclaimed, the kind that did not need response to be complete. Shadow leaned into it by a fraction, then stilled, comforted without attachment. The stars shifted overhead, reflected and broken by the moving water, a reminder that even what looked fixed was always in motion. Not every miracle announced itself with light. Some arrived the way spring did, patient and unnoticed, through choices that did not demand recognition, through the refusal to look away when looking would have been easier, through staying when leaving would have been simpler. Jonas remained there until the night cooled, listening to the lake breathe and the forest answer. When he rose to go inside, Shadow stood with him, not waiting for instruction, not seeking approval. They moved together because that was how it was now. Inside, the cabin held the warmth of a day well spent. Shadow claimed his place near the hearth, sunlight replaced by firelight, rest chosen rather than assigned. Jonas set his mug down and reached for a book he had not opened in months, settling into the chair with a sense of time returning to its proper shape. The pages turned slowly, unhurried, as the night deepened around them. Outside, the ice continued to drift apart, carrying winter away piece by piece. Inside, 2 lives shaped by use and abandonment had found a place that asked for nothing more than presence. No uniform, no command, no expectation beyond what they chose to give. Jonas closed the book and listened. There was no sense of waiting now, only being. Shadow's breathing remained steady, a quiet counterpoint to the fire's soft crackle. Jonas let his eyes rest on the dog's silhouette, the scars faint beneath fur that no longer hid them or defined him. "Stay," Jonas said softly, not his order, but his invitation. Shadow did not move. He did not need to. Here, where the ice no longer held and the lake gave back what it had taken, both of them belonged. When the noise fades, what remains is rarely the spectacle. It is the quiet choices that linger, the ones no one applauds, the ones made when no one is watching. This story was never only about a man and a dog. It was about loyalty that did not ask for reward, about courage that did not raise its voice, about kindness that chose to stay, even when walking away would have been easier. Some wounds do not disappear, they soften. They learn how to breathe again in safe places beside steady hearts. And sometimes, healing does not come from being fixed, but from being allowed to be. Across this world, there are people like Jonas, and partners like Shadow. They stand quietly between what is fragile and what would break it. They do not seek recognition. They simply refuse to turn away. If this story left you with a moment of stillness, hold on to it. Let it remind you that goodness often works in silence, and hope does not always arrive with noise. Not every hero wears a badge, and not every story makes the headlines. Here at Shadow K9 Unit, we keep their courage alive. Subscribe today so you'll never miss the next untold story of officers and their K9 partners.